There's Rita. She's been trying to get in. She's been texting me. All right, and so I'm going to turn it over to Michael Showalter, who will begin his presentation of Ephrata Cloister, a village like no other. And there we go, back.
So again, thank you everybody thank you for joining us. Thank you for your patience as we all learn together here about how this all works. We're going to talk about historic Ephrata Cloister, a village like no other. Now today, if you come to visit the town of Ephrata, you probably come down the main street. You'll find a town in northern Lancaster County of about 14,000 people. It's a town that is a pleasant place to live. But if you were trying to visit this place back in the 1700s, you'd be coming a little bit different way. You'd be traveling out of Philadelphia on what was known as the King's Highway. Once it reaches Ephrata, it kind of changes its name a bit and becomes known as the Paxton Road. But there's the travel on an old map coming out of Philadelphia to the town of Ephrata. But our story really doesn't start in Ephrata. In fact, it starts in a little town called Eberbach, Germany. And today, Eberbach is about the same size as the modern-day Ephrata. It's located along the Neckar River, and it's a very old town. This image shows it as the walled city, and portions of that wall still survive. And any of you who have had opportunity to visit Eberbach may recognize some things such as the tower. There's something called the Powder Tower right here. And there's something called the Hat Tower, which is right over here. So you see they still exist today. It was in Eberbach in 1691 when Conrad Beissel was born. He was the last of 10 children. He never knew his father. His father had died a few months before he was born. His mother died when he was 8 years old. And while this image of the town looks fairly pleasant, it really wasn't in those days. It was in the center of a region known as the Palatinate in Germany, and it was an area that was absolutely devastated by a series of wars. The biggest, the 30 Years' War, ended in 1648, and it took that area almost 100 years to reach its population that it had prior to the war. There were a couple of other wars late in the 17th century, and they all affected Beissel's life. He was taken around to be raised by other brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. Probably only had about 3 or so years of formal schooling by his uncle in a neighboring town. As a young man, Beissel learned to be a baker. That was his father's trade, his grandfather's trade, so it seemed natural. And to learn the craft, he was required to travel to other towns and work with other bakers. In his travels, he eventually wound up in Heidelberg, the capital of that region. And when he arrived, he was introduced to a group of people known as the Pietists. Now, the Pietists were part of a religious movement, not a separate independent church, but a group of people within established churches who sought to kind of further the Reformation that had begun centuries earlier. The Pietists wanted to use the Bible as a guide for living, and they wanted to live a very simple life, and they called one another brother and sister. They liked to have little gatherings to study the Bible and sing and pray. The problem was those gatherings were illegal. Remember, there's no separation of church and state in Europe at this time, and the minister is also a government official, and you can't have a meeting without a government official present. Well, without inviting the minister to these little gatherings, the Pietists were breaking the law. So they would hide in the forests and in attics and other sorts of areas to gather to have their worship services together. They got them in trouble, and many Pietists were thrown out of the areas where they were living. Beissel was thrown out of Heidelberg. He traveled around a bit, met another group of people called the Community of True Inspiration, who believed there were living prophets. But he didn't fit too well with them, so a friend encouraged him to come to Pennsylvania. And this image of the Philadelphia from the harbor was painted in 1720, the same year that Conrad Beissel arrived. So this is the image he would have seen coming into the harbor of Philadelphia. And it wasn't quite the giant city that it would become, but it was still a very important city full of a great diversity of people, ideas, languages, backgrounds. In fact, one immigrant called the ship he came on a Noah's Ark of people who had come to settle this new land. Beissel didn't find a home in Philadelphia, but north of it, several miles in Germantown, with Peter Becker. Becker had been the leader of the Church of the Brethren, and he had brought some of his followers here to America the year before Beissel arrived. Beissel spent the winter with Becker, but he was still restless. So in 1721, he moved out to the Conestoga region, right along the Mill Creek just outside of Birdenhand. And it was there that he decided to try and live as a hermit. But he was also introduced to the ideas of the Church of the Brethren. Becker was the leader of the Church of the Brethren, so it seemed a natural fit, and he, in fact, was baptized and joined the church in 1724. But he still struggled with his own ideas and things he was reading and discussing with other people. Beissel developed a unique theology all of his own. And I often like to compare it to a candle. He says there's both light and heat coming off of the candle. For Beissel, that dual nature of the candle is also represented in a dual nature of God. Beissel said that God is both male and female. The male characteristics are represented by Christ, whereas the female characteristics were represented by something he called the Virgin Sophia. And this image of a winged figure from the Christian ABC book, Made at Ephrata, is an image that really is used throughout 17th and 18th century Europe and America to represent the idea of the Virgin Sophia. So you see, Beissel's ideas aren't completely original, but he puts his own spin on the story. He says these elements of male and female are within each person, and that men have too much masculine elements, women have too much feminine elements. He said you should work to balance those portions, and if you get it in proper balance, at the return of God, which he thought was very soon, he said you could then unite with God, almost marry God. Those are ideas that spawn the elements of his theology that included celibacy, and he also developed the idea of worshiping on Saturday while he was still living in the Conestoga region. By 1728, he had left the Church of the Brethren, and some folks left with him, but he remained living down there close to Birdenhand and Leola until 1732, when he moved to a cabin owned by a friend of his along the Cocalico Creek at the spot where Ephrata now stands. Again, he thought he was going to be alone in a sort of a wilderness retreat, but instead, former friends of his began to follow him, word of his settlement began to spread, and more people came. By about 1750, we had about 40 celibate brothers and about 40 celibate sisters living in this community. And the list of names that you see here is taken from the community's history, called the Chronicon Ephratens. And this attempts to list the celibate members around 1741. But there were not just celibates, there were also families, husbands, wives, and children. And here's a list of some of those names. This is the first list we have of those names, printed in 1770 by a person who was gathering information on various Anabaptist groups in the region. Together, these people all formed the community of Ephrata. And while the married members lived much like the other people of the region, the celibates had a much different outlook on their life. This great wall chart that was created at the community about 1750 is sort of a picture of the life they represented here at Ephrata. It's a maze or a labyrinth, And the fun of the labyrinth is to go in and kind of get yourself lost and figure out how to get out the other side. Well, that's exactly what's happening at Ephrata. The idea was you would go into the community and you would lose yourself. You would lose the world and all of its trappings, and you would come out the other side a pure, clean person ready to accept God. Now, that took a lot of work and a lot of discipline. In 1745, a book was created in the Sisters' House, and this is the title page to the book, called The Rose, and it is sort of a rule book for the sisterhood. We don't know if there was a companion book for the brothers, and if there was, we don't know where it's at, if it even survives. But a lot of information about daily life comes from The Rose, including a schedule. Now, I think the way the schedule is described in The Rose is maybe the ideal, not necessarily how it was always practiced. But let me show you exactly what The Rose says. Divides the day into certain hours, starting at 5 in the morning. And at 5 in the morning, it's time to get dressed. Both men and women, the celibate community, wore these long white robes. The robes not only unified them together as a community, but separated them from the rest of the world. I'm not quite sure that the brothers who worked in the fields and the mills wore these white robes all the time, but they certainly had such a set of clothing to wear for worship services. And was it always pure white? Well, no, the Rose tells us they have a dirty kind of gray set for everyday wear, and then there's a nice clean set to wear for the worship services on Saturday. When you're getting up at between 5 and 6 and getting dressed, there's also time in that hour for private meditation. Beissel is always interested in having a chance for personal relationships with God, so he provides lots of time for private meditation. The Rose says work really begins about 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, this is a sister's house where the sisters lived after 1745. Prior to that, they were living in 2 other structures we've not completely identified and may not survive. The following year, after the sisters moved in, the brothers built themselves a new dormitory. This building was taken away in 1908. By that point, it had become old and kind of shaky, and they just removed that structure. But the sisters' house does survive. Inside those buildings at 6 o'clock, work is starting in the morning. For everybody, there's cooking to be done, but everybody also shares in the sewing duties, the laundry duties, and in spinning thread. Both brothers and sisters did all of these activities. They're usually associated with just the female gender in the 18th century. 9 o'clock in the morning, the schedule of the Rose says, is an hour for private meditation. It could have been a chance for you to read, a chance to go for a walk in this pleasant weather, a chance for you to work on writing. It's your opportunity to commune with God. But when that time is over, it's back to work. I chose to put in this image of the sisters' house before the restoration because I think it's always interesting to see what things look like early on before the work began. Inside the sisters' house and outside, the sisters are doing all sorts of jobs, tending the gardens, taking care of the community's cows. There were 2 or 3 cows, making baskets and candles. That sort of work was going on until noon. And at noon was another hour for private meditation. But another part of the work was writing the German Gothic style of lettering known as Frakturschriften, and the ornate penmanship and flowers and illustrations that go with it. Sisters, wrong button. There we go. Music books were created with very ornate and elaborative and imaginative sorts of flowers. And it's in the music book illustrations where you find a little bit of color. But the most spectacular work created at Ephrata was known as the Christian ABC, a set of alphabets Actually, the alphabet is drawn 6 different times with different sets of ornaments around it. And that is sort of a pattern book. I'm just showing you 2 pages here. That's the letter E if you don't recognize it. And the page on the right is the entire ABCs in what I often call the ribbon alphabet. It's a little smaller than the larger pages, and it's the one that shows up in a lot of the music books. A lot of this lettering was used to write and make things such as book plates and dedication pages for books. Also, what we call wall charts or wall placards, large posters that hung around in the buildings, reminding people of the kind of life they should be pursuing here in this early community. Now, 12 o'clock noon comes. It is another hour for private meditation. Again, you can spend it as you wish. And then at 1 o'clock, it's time to begin work. While the sisters are doing all the gardening and that sort of thing, what are the brothers doing down in the brothers' house? This is the brothers' dormitory again, but they're outside in the fields farming. They're operating 5 different kinds of mills: a sawmill, a grist mill, a paper mill, a fulling mill, an oil mill. They're building structures and they're making furniture. Ephrata has a very distinctive style of furniture. This is carpenters who build houses, not fine joiners who are doing great dovetails and fancy work. Wooden hinges and wooden latches are found in a lot of the furniture made in early Ephrata, simply to save money rather than making ironwork. The biggest job for the brothers was the operation of a printing press, starting about 1745. And over the next 50 years, they produced about 50 different items for themselves and about another 30 or 40 different items for outside customers. They not only had the press, they made their own paper, they set the type, they had a tannery and made their own book bindings. So it was a complete one-stop shopping for purchasing a book in colonial America, something that really didn't exist in other regions. If you wanted a book in Philadelphia, you had to go get the paper, then you had to take it to the printer, then you had to take it after it's printed down to the street to the bookbinder. It's all here at Ephrata. And that may be one reason why the Mennonites came to Ephrata in 1745-48 and asked them to produce the largest book published in America, The Martyr's Mirror. This volume provides the history of early Christian martyrs, and a lot of ancestors of the Anabaptist faith are listed in this book. Today, the book is still valued, especially by the Old Order Mennonites and the Amish people. And copies can still be found fairly easily today. Then at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the schedule says there's another hour for private meditation before it's time for, well, what have we missed? The meal. Weissel says food is one of those things that only is required by a human body. And once you reach heaven, you won't need that nourishment. You'll be in heaven and be fulfilled. So you should learn not to eat too much here on earth. This is a time for practice for heaven. The meal was fairly simple. One visitor who eats with the brothers records having barley boiled in milk, pumpkin mush, bread, butter. He mentions a cottage cheese type dish and water. A very simple, meager diet that's served at 6 in the evening. I don't believe they could accomplish some of this work on just that one single meal during the day. And in fact, the schedule does provide time at 9 in the morning for a little nourishment. And I suspect pick up a piece of bread or an apple sometime in the middle of the day is also welcome. Following the meal in the evening, there were lessons. Lessons in music and singing, and also lessons in writing. Again, I'm not quite sure it's the Fractor that's being done in the dim evening light, but writing and reading are listed as activities during that lesson period from 7 to 9 at night. At 9, it's time to retire for the evening. Everyone returns to their small room and in there until midnight. At midnight, there is a 2-hour worship service. This is called the watch service. Scripture says Christ will return like a thief in the night. Well, they wanted to be awake and ready to meet him. And if he's not here by 2 in the morning, well, then you can return to your bed. And what is your bed? A wooden bench and a block of wood for a pillow. The idea is that you never know exactly when God's going to return. You don't want to be sound asleep and miss the big event. Plus, if you're sound asleep, you may drift off into dreams. And Beisel saw dreams as the devil's way of entering your mind. You want to keep the devil out. So no dreams, no comfortable sleeping until 5 in the morning when the day starts all over again, and you wake and you dress and you have another hour for meditation. That was the plan from Sunday through Friday. Friday, after the meal, there's time for worship and study, and then Saturday is the main worship service of the day. You'd find probably Beisel leading that main worship service in a third meeting house that does not survive. It would have stood on a hill behind our present visitor center, and there you would have found the brothers seated down on the main floor and the sisters up above in a gallery. Services would have consisted of scripture reading, sermons, and music. I mentioned music earlier. Beisel has his own system for composing 4-part harmony, and his rules for composition are some of the first published in America. Including the writers are brothers and sisters and some of the first female composers in America. I'm going to play a little sample of music. I don't know where the volume is on your particular machine, so just want to warn you that I'm going to play a little sample of music here for you. Oh. That's just one verse. There's 7 more to follow that, but a very rough translation of that verse is something like, I wander on at peaceful rate until I enter heaven's gate. I walk, I run, I stand so still. I wait for nothing but God's will. Periodically, the community gathered for special fellowship meals as well, known as Love Feast. Love Feast would begin by washing one another's feet as a sign of humility. That would be followed by a meal, a much nicer meal than that daily diet. It included usually lamb or beef stew. And then the evening ended with communion with bread and wine. There was no stated time to have Love Feast, just as it was requested. We know the sisters were having their own private Love Feast. If a married member wanted to host a Love Feast in his home, he would ask permission of Beisel, and Beisel would grant that, and then the individual could invite all those he wished to invite. So in some ways, while Love Feast was to be a unifying celebration, could also cause dissension within the groups. I can imagine some brother or sister saying, why didn't I get an invitation to that Love Feast? Conrad Beisel, of course, was the center of life and management of the community during his lifetime, but he died in 1768. And with him, a lot of the deep impassioned spirit that created the community also left. Following Beisel's death, the community began to decline. Peter Miller became the second leader of the community, and while far superior to Beisel in education, Miller didn't have the charisma of Beisel and wasn't able to attract new followers to this unique way of life. Times had changed. Younger children of the married members were reaching maturity at that point. They didn't want to be saddled with this old-fashioned way of life, especially after the Revolutionary War, when there was plenty of new land to settle out west. The brothers and sisters who remained pulled together and adapted their life to support one another. They started bringing in soft beds and adding more food to their diet, stopped holding that midnight worship service. And as time goes on, their numbers decrease so that by 1813, the last of the celibate members died. The following year, the remaining married members came together to form the German Seventh-day Baptist Church. This is the seal that was used to imprint into documents by the community. And the church was never large. It was probably maybe 50, 75 members when it really started in 1814, and that number kept declining through time. Some of the members of the community who were in need of support came to live in the buildings, and they adapted the buildings. These illustrations from 1880 show you that here's looking into one of those bedrooms. Now we have chairs, we have dressers, we have curtains on the windows. That clock that's pictured there on the left still survives in our collection. This image of about 1990 shows you that the buildings had gone through some changes. You'll notice all the dormer windows are missing from on the meeting house, the Zoll on the right. Only 2 dormer windows survive on the left. A lot of the rough boards used to patch things as best as possible. Inside, the balconies had been removed. A potbelly stove had been added for a little bit of warmth. And this was still the meeting room for the congregation until by the early 1900s, members had begun to gather together the old materials, the tables and dishes and baskets, and they put them on display behind chicken wire. That way you could see them, but you couldn't reach in and take them. And for a brief period in the late 1920s, they were asking for 25 cents for a tour. But by 1934, tensions had grown between the remaining members within the community, and the church was closed. In 1941, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania purchased the property from the last members of the church. And this newspaper clipping shows the governor. And this is the governor is the man with the little, let me see if I can get my pointer here. Oh, that's the governor. Oh, well, hang on. I'm learning. There, that's the governor. And this is Dr. Menser, who was running the property for 7 years under the auspices of the Court of Pennsylvania. And this is one of the last members. This is Katie Cockle. Her 2 daughters are looking over her shoulders. Her daughters were never members of the congregation. Once the state acquired the property, restoration began. And this is showing some of the work going on in the meeting house. The building, the south wall of the building was built on a sloping rock ledge. And so the foundation was actually sliding in underneath the building. So you see here the workmen rebuilding that foundation. While the state is busy doing the maintenance of the property and the restoration of the property, community members began to come together to form the Ephrata Cloister Associates. They created a museum store, they began to recreate crafts, and establish the Ephrata Cloister Chorus and provide school programs. Today, all sorts of activities happen at the Ephrata Cloister throughout the year. concerts and learning sessions and school programs and visits from people from around the world. So I hope that sometime soon we'll all be able to be together again at the historic Ephrata Cloister. I want to thank everybody for spending their time with me this morning, and I look forward to seeing if there's some questions here that we can help answer. Thank you. And that concludes my part of the program. I'm not sure if there are questions out there.
I don't see any questions in the
No
chat.
questions.
If you can look in the chat, your chat, Michael, in case they came directly to you or anything.
I don't have a chat. Where do I have a chat?
It should be down along the bottom. There should be a little text bubble box, just to make sure we don't miss anybody. Oh, here we go. What kind of oil? Here we go. What kind of oil was produced in the oil mill?
Oh, yes. Okay. So the oil mill made linseed oil, and that is a foundation element for the ink used on the printing press. The linseed oil, same kind of linseed oil you use for oil paint, but the brothers' oil mill was making the oil for the ink that was used on the printing press.
Okay. And any other questions out there? We'll give you a few moments to type. Michael, I thank you for this.
Well, and I want to thank everybody. This is really designed to be a very short overview history, so I'm sure it was just review for most of you who are normal folks who support us all the time, but this gave us an opportunity to try out the technology, and we appreciate your patience as we learn together about that.
Yes, one thing about this whole situation is that we've had a chance, an opportunity to learn this technology, and we're still still working at it as we go. So we hope to continue this sort of thing going forward and have more online programs as we go forward. We have another question. Where were the mills located?
Where?
Where?
Okay. So originally, the mills were located down behind the library where the old mill stands, Old Mill Road. The mill that is there today has a maybe small portion of the first floor or foundation area that may date to the Brotherhood period. But that mill was sold by the church in the 1850s, and the new owner greatly expanded the building itself. If you look closely, you can see he even added a third floor to the building. But that would have been the site for the mills, and we believe, based on a description that of a fire that occurred at the mills, that there were 5 different mills who all shared the same shaft, the same power source on one giant water wheel of some sort. The oil mill that made that linseed oil, a sawmill, a grist mill for grinding grain, and a paper mill, and a fulling mill. And the fulling mill is the one most folks aren't familiar with. Fulling is a process of cleaning and processing woolen cloth. The cloth is washed in hot water to sort of shrink it and tighten the weave, and sometimes it's brushed to give it a little bit of a nap, a little bit of a fuzz. By the 1750s, the brothers abandoned the paper mill, or probably abandoned the paper mill down at that location, and built a second paper mill, and that was located at the site of the old factory, which is next to us right by Main Street there, where Main Street and Fulton Street divides. That paper mill was built by the brothers in the 1750s. By the 1770s, it was being operated by some of the married members. They gave up the paper mill about 1810-ish, and then it was operated by another person until about the 1820s, when it was sold. In the 1860s, the original mill was torn away and rebuilt as a grist mill. But the foundations of the original mill are still in the basement of that, buried in the basement of that factory building.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. So with that, I'd like to, let me undo my, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today as we try out this technology, and do follow us on Facebook at Historic Ephrata Cloister for upcoming educational programs online that we hope to do. And thank you again very much.
And,
And
and,
thank you, Michael.
and if you do have any follow-up questions, just to get a hold of me, just send me an email, give us a call, and I will be happy to help you with any questions you may have.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I don't know, somehow I lost.